how come it's so difficult for those gentlemen to raise a date even for a meeting among the three foreign ministers? Finally, they did. Congratulations, but it has been quite a difficult process. Ms. Hwang, Professor Hwang.
Well, I think that the issue right now is a focus perhaps too much on those issues that divide the three countries. These three countries have very much in common in terms of interests. And you mentioned that economy is certainly one of them, but also other areas of common concern, such as cooperation on environmental issues, for example. So I think the focus on common interests should be able to bring the three together.
How much common interest really is there, particularly when we are moving up to the G20 summit? We're likely to see or not see sometimes bilateral meetings or not. Ms. Goto.
I think what we really need to bear in mind is that there is a lot of concern about political conflict taking over the other interests. As the professor said earlier, there are a lot of interests of mutual concern to the three countries. And I really should point out, on the economic front, we are seeing, for instance, from the IMF, that there are considerable downside risks to the global economy. We are seeing Europe facing considerable challenges, not least because of the exodus of Britain from the European Union. We are seeing instability in the Middle East. The real bright spot in the global economy right now remains Asia, and especially in East Asia. And it is vital, not just for the region, but for the world, to ensure that these three countries work together. And there are challenges. Let's take, for instance, trade agreements. There are many challenges, but many opportunities as well. And we need to keep our eyes on the ball.
We need to really keep our eyes on the ball. We've been distracted for quite some time, I have to say. But Ms. Liu, given the sentiments that we had months ago and even over the past few years, is it easy that all capitals come together, particularly from Northeast Asia? As the other two ladies just indicated, these economies are extremely important these days.
Yes, of course, you're absolutely right, and I agree with them because China and South Korea and Japan are actually working on their free trade agreements. For instance, the free trade agreements between the three countries, and also free trade agreements between ASEAN +3, +6. So we're also working toward the East Asia economic community, so which can be achieved by 2020. So actually, there are a lot of grounds that we can work on together, aside from those political confrontations.
But those political confrontations, or shall I say at least the spar of words, does in a way influence the sentiment of discussion. That's why in a way these foreign ministers have such a difficult time even figuring out a meeting among the three of them. Professor Hwang, how much vision really should politicians these days have? And how much, shall I say, understanding of the future they need to demonstrate this time during the G20 summits among all the G20 leaders? Please go ahead.
Well, I think there is an issue here. We talked about how the common interests of economic growth and so on is shared by the three countries. But let me point out that these political so-called distractions, these are not trivial, and they're actually quite related to the economic issues. Now, I disagree a bit with what Ms. Goto said earlier. I don't think East Asia is really the bright spot right now in the global economy. In fact, each of these three great economies are facing some very serious challenges internally. And the issue becomes if each one decides to pursue their own economic national interests, which then could come into conflict. And of course, it's very political because each of these countries' leaders, unfortunately, and the publics are quite nationalistic. So I think the leaders have to understand that through cooperation, instead of promoting just self-national interests, in terms of economic growth, that it is better for all three countries.
But Professor Hwang, if I could just follow up very lightly on what you have just said. When you said these three economies are having their problem, yes, they do. But the question is, any economy in the world these days, who doesn't?
That's exactly right. But this is the point of the G20 and why G20 is so important. Because it brings together 20 of perhaps not the largest nations, but the most important nations to try to say that cooperation in terms of national economic interests can produce global economic prosperity for all.
Right. And Ms. Goto, I want to further approach this in the direction that you have mentioned earlier. If there are problems, we seem to have some common problems, and yet in different circumstances. Structural reform, that's the common problem facing the three economies, South Korea, China, and Japan. Different stretch of time, of course, and different circumstances, but it's a common problem. Meanwhile, there's another common problem. How will this region trade with one another, given might be some distrust issues, given might be some geopolitical changes that might be with us for years and probably even decades to come. So the question is, can we have a bigger vision, and where would that come from? Ms. Goto.
Right. Well, I think that really hits nail on the head, because it really brings home the fact that this meeting that's happening in Tokyo right now is very important. The three countries are now engaged in dialogue, and we shouldn't take that lightly, because at the introduction we've heard that these meetings have been cancelled in the past over political tension, and there is also concern that this particular meeting may also be cancelled as well. So the fact that it is happening, and the fact that the ministers from both China and Korea are willing and able to come to Tokyo is very much a step in the right direction, and hopefully it will lead to further dialogue, and dialogue is the first step, of course, to greater understanding and hopefully to trust. Now, when we go to these common challenges that these three countries face, and you mentioned the whole idea of social change, the need for social change. What we have seen, for instance, in the success of an economic formula in these three countries have been about being able to meet the needs of expansion. So all three have really been export-led economies, manufacturing goods meeting demands of the global market at a cheaper cost. That formula has worked in the past, but it's not a formula that's going to work in the future. And therefore, can there be social changes that will be able to meet a more service-led economic growth?
I probably know more about China's approach than the other two economies. So if I understand right, and Ms. Liu, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that China is trying to work on that by trying to expand the domestic market, to let its domestic market consume ever more than it used to be, so that there will be less trade frictions, there will be less conflicts with other trading nations as well. But of course, that's a process. So the question is now, during this process, what can be done? Can the G20 summit, also with the three foreign ministers meeting, provide some very basic framework or groundwork for that?
Well, I think that's exactly why the G20 meeting is so important, because it is actually a meeting trying to prevent a framework which can be agreed upon by leaders from developed economies and also by leaders from developing economies. And I cannot say in particular what we can achieve in this September.
Because we don't know. Even the foreign minister meeting could be such a challenge.
But we can draw from our past experiences. For instance, after the 2008, the financial crisis hit, and the G20 countries have actually worked together and to prevent this economic crisis from going into like a very catastrophe. So this is actually working.
Having said that, though, ladies, let's face the reality. I just want to do a reality check with all of you. Women are very good with reality checks, by the way. So may I just mention one part of it, that is the kinds of geopolitical thing that's going on still with us. For example, this year's drills between the United States and South Korea began on Monday for a 12-day run, largely computer-simulated war games. Training involved 25,000 U.S. troops and 50,000 South Korean soldiers, according to both militaries. China's news agency Xinhua said on Monday that the move could, as they say, quote, jeopardize peace and stability in Northeast Asia, and of course, and could lead to vicious cycle of violence for violence. That, of course, is a response to all the latest development on the Korean Peninsula. Professor Hwang, of course, from the U.S. perspective, you're really an expert on the issue. So many tug of wars, at least in words, over the past few days and weeks on the issue. Korean Peninsula peace and stability, the big key part of where Northeast Asia is going and whether the economies could work well. So at this point, leading up to the G20, we're seeing still so many elements that likely to influence the result of G20 or the sentiment of the G20. How should we understand this?
Well, first of all, I don't think the issue on the Korean Peninsula should really affect the G20. Look, I actually very strongly disagree with this assessment of these current exercises that are now going on the Korean Peninsula. First of all, these are not just U.S. South Korea. These also include 9 other countries of the Neutral Nations Supervisor Committee. This is all part of the UN forces that actually fought the war on the Korean Peninsula, ending in an armistice. So the exercises, the military exercises, are an annual event. They have gone on almost every single year since 1953. They are under the supervision of the Armistice Agreement, which was signed by the DPRK, by the way, and endorsed by the PRC. So, and there is zero correlation, and this has been proven from study to study, that shows that these exercises, despite what North Korea claims, and unfortunately supported by China, have not led to increase in provocation between North and South Korea.
All right.
Well, let's get to the point.
Okay.
The instability on the Korean Peninsula right now is due to North Korea's violation of international agreements and standards.
Professor Hwang, you got your time. You got your time.
And nuclear weapons proliferation.
You got your time. Let's
well,
have
I do
Liu.
have some disagreements with the lady, because something which is happening annually and regularly doesn't make it right. So if you're going to do the right thing, you have to stop this vicious cycle of trying to provoke another country. And for instance, we can all think outside the box. For instance, what if the U.S. Army, U.S. troops withdraw from Korean Peninsula or from Japan? And what if North Korea can allow IAEA nuclear investigators into the country and can work things out and can work for a denuclearization of this peninsula?
I can see you're very excited about your idea, and I can see Professor Hwang keep on blinking her eyes, seem to questioning the possibility you have raised. But can you be more clear with us, Ms. Liu, when you are proposing these ideas? To what extent these ideas is about thinking out of the box? To what extent these ideas are actually wishful thinking at this critical time? What do you think?
Well, we can take a look at the history. When China and the United States established diplomatic relations, is that thinking out of the box? It is. When look at the United States, when it established this diplomatic relations with Cuba, is that thinking outside of the box?
Well, we're not going to discuss just China-U.S. relation. We'll leave it to another program because we're having limited time. So we still got Tokyo that has not been mentioned much. So let me, just to be fair, go to Ms. Goto for your further analysis. China, Japan, of course, we all know there have been a lot of disputes, disagreements as well. Now, the issue, as we mentioned earlier, is will this be an opportunity that disagreement geopolitically, will give way to the very common interests of economic development? And will constituencies back at home be able to support that possibility? Ms. Goto.
Well, as you said, the common interest here is to ensure peace and stability. The unfortunate fact, though, is that conflict between Japan and China are manifold, not least over territorial disputes in the East China Sea, but it's also extended to territorial disputes in the South China Sea, insofar as, whilst Japan doesn't have any territorial claims in the South China Sea, it is very much a proponent of the latest decision by the international authorities to adhere to the existing rule of law. So there are philosophical challenges here in terms of what kind of rules should be prevail moving forward in the region, and I don't think Japan and China necessarily see eye to eye on that.
All right.
But I do know.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, but I do know that no one wants to see these territorial disputes escalate any further, and certainly no one wants to see this result in any military conflict.
We only got 40 seconds left for three of you ladies, so every one of you, if you can, provide us with an expectation, realistic expectation, by the way, ladies, for the upcoming, before the G20. Let's just have some realistic expectation, at least for the ministers of the foreign ministers of three countries. What can they reach, at least that they can work on? Let's begin with Ms. Goto. 10 seconds for you.
If they can come up with a joint statement, a joint communique after this meeting, I think that would be heralded as a major breakthrough.
What should be in that statement?
It doesn't matter, the fact that they've reached it.
What should be in that statement?
That they will meet again. and they will continue to engage in dialogue.
Okay. And Professor Hwang, 10 seconds for you as well.
The G20, that meeting will be fine if they can focus on common economic interests. Let me just say that I agree with Ms. Goto, but I point out that it is not just Japan and China that are disagreeing. It is frankly the United States, South Korea, Japan, and many, many other nations of the world that are having issues with the principles behind some of Chinese actions.
All right, you got your accusations over there. Ms. Liu, what
It
about
is,
you?
again, not an accusation,
Realistic
it's an
expectation
observation.
from you. You got your 10
Well,
seconds.
for the trilateral foreign ministers meeting, I think if they can agree to disagree, and I think that's a big progress.